At 3 minutes past midnight on Wednesday this week, a 50% tariff is scheduled to hit a long list of Canadian goods crossing into the United States: honey, liquor, cement, dairy, hockey sticks, even dog leashes and wigs. That is not a hypothetical. That is a signed presidential proclamation, dated July the 20th, invoking a rarely used section of a law written in 1930, and it is aimed squarely at Ottawa. The question hanging over this entire story is simple to state and brutally hard to answer. What actually happens if Prime Minister Mark Carney refuses to fold before that deadline arrives? To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back further than most headlines bother to. The trade relationship between Washington and Ottawa did not break down this summer. It has been cracking, piece by piece, for years. Since Donald Trump returned to office, Canada has absorbed a rolling series of tariff actions: a 25% duty on most goods with a lower rate carved out for energy, tariffs on steel and aluminum, tariffs on autos, and repeated threats of more to come. Canada hit back each time. In early 2025, Ottawa announced roughly $30 billion in retaliatory tariffs on American products, everything from steel and aluminum to yogurt and whiskey, a direct answer to Washington's own metal tariffs. That back and forth set the pattern for everything that followed: threat, retaliation, negotiation, uneasy pause, then another threat. The current crisis traces its roots to two separate moves made only weeks apart. Earlier in July, the Trump administration announced it would not renew the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, the trade pact known as CUSMA, opting instead to trigger a formal review process that, under the terms of the original deal, could stretch out until 2036. That decision cast a shadow over the entire architecture of North American trade, because CUSMA is the mechanism that lets most Canadian goods enter the United States tariff-free in the first place. Without a renewed and confirmed agreement, that protection becomes something Ottawa cannot fully count on. Then, on July the 20th, came the harder blow. Trump signed 3 proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a Depression-era statute that gives a sitting president the power to impose tariffs of up to 50% on the goods of any country found to be discriminating against the United States. According to senior administration officials, the justification centered on what the White House characterized as unfair treatment of American dairy, alcohol, and motor vehicle interests inside the Canadian market. The tariffs, set at 50%, were scheduled to take effect on August 19th. It is worth pausing here on what is actually covered, because the details matter more than the headline number. According to a breakdown compiled by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the new 50% duties apply across 3 separate lists of Canadian exports. One targets dairy products directly: milk, cream, whey, and related ingredients. A second, confusingly labeled the motor vehicles list, contains almost no actual cars at all. Instead, it sweeps in electronics and telecom equipment, furniture and home goods, building materials like lumber, plywood, doors and cement, plastics and packaging, clothing, footwear and luggage, toys and sporting goods, industrial machinery, cosmetics and fragrances, and agricultural goods such as flowers, plants, and seeds. The Associated Press, reporting from Vancouver, added more specific examples to that list: honey, liquor, essential oils, perfumes, candles, hockey sticks, even dog leashes and wigs. Notably excluded from the new 50% tariff are energy products, potash, fish, and critical minerals, sectors that remain, for now, outside the blast radius. The dollar figures give some sense of scale without exaggerating it. Randall Bartlett, Deputy Chief Economist at Desjardins, one of Canada's largest financial institutions, put the value of affected exports at roughly 28 billion Canadian dollars annually, or about 19.8 billion American dollars. That represents somewhere around 5% of everything the United States imports from Canada each year. Bartlett told reporters the tariffs have the potential to shave 2 to 3/10 of a percentage point off Canadian economic growth in both 2026 and 2027, though he stopped short of predicting a recession. He described the more likely effect as keeping investment on the sidelines and suppressing hiring, weighing on both consumer activity and residential construction. Not every economist reads the number the same way. Joseph Steinberg, writing for the policy outlet The Hub, argued the headline 50% figure overstates the real-world impact. Because the affected goods represent only about 5.5% of Canadian exports, Steinberg calculated the tariffs actually raise Canada's overall effective tariff rate by something closer to 2.5 percentage points. A meaningful hit to specific industries, but nowhere near the economy-wide shock the raw 50% number implies on its own. Key categories like oil and automobiles, he pointed out, remain exempt entirely. That divide in economic opinion mirrors a deeper divide in how to interpret Trump's motives. Fen Osler-Hampson, a professor of international affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa, told the Associated Press that the specific products targeted by the new tariffs are largely items the United States itself needs or consumes regularly. which he suggested could make the threat more about applying negotiating pressure than about achieving any coherent trade policy goal. Hampson also cautioned Canadian officials directly against escalating the fight by reducing oil or electricity shipments south of the border. "You don't want to poke the bear," he said. "You get into that kind of war, we're going to lose." Two political flashpoints complicated the run-up to the August 19th deadline, and both are worth understanding on their own terms because they show how tangled trade and diplomacy have become in this relationship. The first involves wildfires. In the weeks before the new tariffs were announced, Trump publicly criticized Canada over wildfires burning through northwestern Ontario, smoke from which drifted across large sections of the American Midwest and Northeast. Writing on his social media platform Truth Social, Trump claimed the pollution had cost the United States billions of dollars and said those costs must of necessity be added to the tariffs Canada is currently paying. A senior administration official later clarified that the new 50% tariffs announced on July the 20th were not directly tied to the wildfires, while acknowledging that Trump has asked for options on the issue separately. The second flashpoint involves the Middle East. In late July, Carney announced that Canada intended to formally recognize a Palestinian state at the United Nations General Assembly in September, contingent on the Palestinian Authority agreeing to hold elections and implement democratic reforms. The move followed similar announcements from the United Kingdom and France. Trump reacted within hours on Truth Social, writing, "Wow, Canada has just announced that it is backing statehood for Palestine. That will make it very hard for us to make a trade deal with them. Oh, Canada." He later told reporters at the White House the position was not necessarily a deal breaker, saying only, "We'll see." Carney, for his part, told reporters that Canada makes our own independent foreign policy positions, and cited the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza as central to the decision. It's worth being precise here about timing. That particular exchange took place in the run-up to an earlier deadline, the one on August 1st that raised tariffs on non-CUSMA goods from 25 to 35%. The current larger 50% threat tied to August 19th stems primarily from the Section 338 proclamation signed on July 20th, though the underlying friction between the two leaders, annexation rhetoric, foreign policy disagreements, tariff threats layered on tariff threats, forms one continuous connected story rather than a series of isolated incidents. That annexation rhetoric deserves its own mention because it colors everything else. Trump has repeatedly suggested, going back to his first months in office this term, that Canada should become the 51st state, a proposal that has been near universally dismissed by Canadian officials and the broader public as being without any serious basis. It resurfaces periodically in his public comments about trade, and Canadian negotiators say privately that it complicates the tone of talks, even when it isn't the direct subject of discussion. As the August 19th deadline approached, the diplomatic machinery in both capitals moved into high gear. Canada's minister, responsible for Canada U, S-Trade, Dominic LeBlanc, alongside Chief Trade Negotiator Janice Charette, spent days camped out in Washington working opposite U, S-Trade Representative Jameson Greer. According to CBC News, the two sides intensified talks after Carney said Trump had personally agreed to accelerate negotiations following the 50% tariff threat. Reuters reported on August 13th that a Canadian government source with direct knowledge of the talks described negotiations as going quite well, adding that Washington, too, appeared eager to reach an agreement before the deadline rather than let it lapse. They also want to come to an agreement before the deadline of August 19th, the source said. This is also their goal. Greer offered his own read on where things stood. Speaking after a round of talks on Thursday, August 13th, he said both Trump and Carney would soon be presented with options based on what negotiators had worked out. Language CBC News described as the clearest signal yet from the American side about how the talks were progressing. The framework reportedly under discussion would see the United States pull back from the new 50% tariffs in exchange for Canada agreeing to a package of concessions, and would also reduce some of the existing Section 232 tariffs Trump has placed on foreign steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, tariffs that predate the current crisis and that hit industries with deeply integrated supply chains stretching across the Canada-U.S. border. Multiple outlets reported specifics of what each side wants, though it's important to flag that sourcing on these details varies in strength. The Globe and Mail, citing unnamed sources familiar with the talks, reported that potential U.S. concessions would include backing away from the 50% tariffs and reducing Section 232 duties on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. In exchange, Canada would reportedly be expected to drop its remaining retaliatory tariffs on American goods, including tariffs on American-made autos. Provincial governments would end bans on U.S. alcohol sales and scrap Buy Canadian procurement preferences. and Ottawa would need to satisfy a set of unspecified American demands the Globe described only as part of a broader package. Bloomberg similarly reported that any final agreement would require Trump's direct approval, and that Canadian officials say the concessions they're prepared to offer depend on receiving meaningful relief from those Section 232 tariffs in return. One specific and striking detail emerged from Globe and Mail sourcing regarding defense. According to two separate sources, U.S. demands for what negotiators are calling Phase 2 of the talks have loomed over the process, and one possibility under discussion involves Canada making a quiet, informal commitment to complete its purchase of F-35 fighter jets, with any formal announcement held back until a second phase of negotiations is concluded. A separate Canadian source suggested Ottawa might also use its willingness to meet other American defense-related requests as a bargaining chip. None of this has been confirmed on the record by either government, and it should be treated as reported, not settled fact. The alcohol question turned into an unexpectedly stubborn sticking point. When Canada retaliated against earlier rounds of American tariffs, several provinces pulled U.S. just-made alcohol off government store shelves entirely, a symbolic but economically real form of retaliation, given how much wine, beer, and spirits move across the border each year. According to a provincial government source cited by the Globe and Mail, American alcohol would only return to Canadian shelves if there is significant and meaningful progress on the Section 232 tariffs affecting steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. The source was blunt about the political reality. There is no way premiers will fold on the alcohol ban simply in exchange for more talks. That comment points to a wider problem for Carney, one that goes beyond what Washington wants, and into what Ottawa's own provinces will accept. Canada's 10 premiers gathered in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, for their annual summer meeting, and the agenda was upended when the White House announced the new 50% tariffs midweek. Carney, speaking to reporters after those discussions, described the situation candidly. Asked whether the August 19th deadline represented a genuine opportunity to reach a comprehensive deal or simply another pressure tactic from the Trump administration, he said, "It's both." He added that the level of American engagement that week reflects the seriousness of the trade relationship and the breadth of the issues on the table. The premiers were not unified on how hard Canada should push back. Ontario's Premier, Doug Ford, has consistently advocated for the most aggressive posture among Canada's provincial leaders, at one point calling for Canada to withhold potash and oil exports as leverage. Language he framed as an attempt to dismantle the American economic position. Ford's frustration was pointed. "It's very hard to deal with President Trump when he changes his mind every single day," he told reporters. "One day, the Prime Minister is with him side by side, and the next thing you know, President Trump turns on him like a rabid dog." Alberta's Premier, Danielle Smith, staked out the opposite position, saying she does not support retaliatory tariffs, particularly ones that would touch the energy sector her province depends on. Carney himself has tried to walk a careful line between these competing provincial pressures and the need to keep negotiators credible in Washington. At an unrelated announcement in Toronto, speaking in French, he delivered what reporters described as an unusually tough message. "The tone is pretty tough. We are going to do everything that would be necessary if there isn't a deal on August 19th. He added that the moment to get tougher would come specifically if negotiations reached a point where no agreement was possible. At the Charlottetown meeting, he went further on the question of retaliation directly, telling reporters, "Everything's on the table if there's no agreement, depending on the outcome of the negotiations." Notably, Carney has been careful to specify that Canada will not retaliate before the tariffs actually take effect, reasoning that acting prematurely could undermine the negotiations still underway. That restraint fits a pattern Carney has maintained since taking office. He removed many of Canada's earlier counter-tariffs on the United States back in September of last year, as a gesture meant to keep negotiations moving while deliberately preserving retaliatory tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos, a signal that those three sectors remain Ottawa's primary leverage points if talks collapse. According to Canada's Department of Finance, that September adjustment reflected an approach of incentivizing a negotiated settlement rather than maintaining broad retaliation for its own sake. The steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs stayed in place specifically because, as the government put it, intensive negotiations with the U.S. continue in those sectors. By the second week of August, the pace of shuttle diplomacy had picked up noticeably. Charette and LeBlanc were reported to remain in Washington through the weekend before the deadline, continuing sessions with Greer's team. According to Globe and Mail sourcing, Charette delivered a pointed message to her American counterpart during one of these meetings. If there is no deal by the deadline and the new tariffs take effect, Canada would effectively be forced to stop negotiating altogether and shift into retaliation. Sources familiar with the exchange said this warning was not framed as a threat, but rather as what one source called a frank explanation of reality, grounded in the anger building among the Canadian public and the unpredictable reactions, likely from provincial leaders if Ottawa is seen as too accommodating. Greer, according to those same sources, acknowledged the message and recognized the political pressure the new tariffs would create inside Canada. American officials were described as optimistic a deal could still be reached by August 19th, but worried about whether any agreement could actually be sold politically back home in Canada. Timing pressure compounded everything. Two sources told the Globe and Mail that any completed agreement would need to be presented to Trump for his personal sign-off by Monday, August 17th, if it was going to be finalized before the Wednesday deadline. As of that Monday, according to reporting from CBC News, the contours of a potential deal had been taking shape, but nothing had actually been agreed to, and Trump had not signed off on anything. CBC's own reporting, posted early on the morning of August 17th, described Canada as continuing to negotiate a trade deal with the United States that will allow it to both avoid Trump's tariff threat and address longer-term structural issues in the relationship, language that captures just how unresolved things remained with barely more than a day left on the clock. It's worth stepping back at this point to look at what a failure to reach a deal would actually mean in practical terms, separating the confirmed from the speculative. What is confirmed? If no agreement is reached, the 50% tariffs on the 3 lists of Canadian goods take effect automatically on August 19th, under the authority Trump already exercised, when he signed the Section 338 proclamations on July the 20th. That much requires no further action from the White House. What is also confirmed, through Carney's own public statements, is that Canada intends to respond with retaliation of some kind if that happens, though the Prime Minister has deliberately avoided specifying which products or sectors would be targeted. What remains uncertain, and should be treated as such, is the exact shape of any Canadian retaliation, whether a partial or last-minute deal gets reached even after the deadline technically passes, and whether Trump's now standard pattern of extending or adjusting deadlines at the last minute repeats itself here, as it has in prior rounds of this trade dispute. That pattern is itself part of the historical record and worth laying out plainly, because it shapes how seriously analysts are treating this particular deadline. Trump's August 1st, 2025 deadline for raising tariffs on non-CUSMA Canadian goods from 25 to 35% did, in fact, take effect as scheduled last year. It was not extended, unlike some of his deadlines involving other trading partners. Carney called that outcome disappointing at the time and said, "Canadians will be our own best customer" in response, while Trump described the situation as one where it was simply too late for countries to strike new deals once his deadline had passed. That history suggests this White House has, at least once already in this specific relationship, been willing to let a deadline bite rather than blink first, which cuts against any assumption that August 19th will automatically resolve itself through a last-second reprieve. The broader economic backdrop adds another layer of context that a purely tariff-focused story can miss. According to RBC Economics, the year of tariff shocks Canada absorbed following the initial escalation in early 2025 produced effects that were, in aggregate, somewhat less severe than many had feared at the time. Canada posted its first per capita GDP increase in 3 years during 2025, and the national unemployment rate moved broadly sideways rather than spiking. Still, RBC's analysis noted the impact beneath that headline was uneven. Specific sectors and regions directly targeted by tariffs were hit hard. Business investment softened even as consumer spending held up. And research from Harvard Business School's pricing lab, done in conjunction with Bank of Canada researchers, found that roughly a quarter of the cost of Canada's retaliatory tariffs on American goods was ultimately passed through to Canadian consumers in the form of higher prices, though those price increases faded relatively quickly once most retaliatory tariffs were lifted in September. That RBC assessment stands in some tension with earlier, more alarming warnings from economists during the initial 2025 escalation. Craig Alexander, president of the research firm Alexander Economic Views, had cautioned at that time that if tariffs were sustained indefinitely, they could almost wipe out 2 years' worth of economic growth in Canada, and predicted the country was likely to slip into at least a mild recession beginning in the second quarter of that year, with unemployment potentially climbing toward 8% from a base of 6.6%. It is worth being honest about the fact that the more dire of those early predictions did not fully materialize, according to RBC's later year-end review, which is itself a useful lesson in how difficult it is to forecast the exact economic fallout of a fast-moving trade dispute, and a reason to treat any single economist's projection about the current 50% tariffs in either direction with a degree of caution. Canada's overall exposure to this relationship is what makes every one of these deadlines so consequential in the first place. The country sends roughly 75% of all its exports to the United States and draws about a third of its imports from its southern neighbor, according to figures cited by CBC News. That level of dependency for economic growth leaves Ottawa with genuinely limited room to maneuver in any prolonged confrontation, a structural reality that both sides understand and that shapes the negotiating posture on both ends of the table. whether the talks are happening in Washington or being debated back home in Ottawa. There's also useful context in how this specific dispute compares to Trump's approach toward other trading partners facing similar deadlines around the same period. The administration applied comparable pressure to Brazil, imposing steep tariffs after Brazil's judiciary indicted former President Jair Bolsonaro, a Trump ally, on charges related to an alleged attempt to overturn his election loss. Economist Jim Stanford, commenting on the Canada situation at the time Trump linked the Palestine statehood issue to trade talks, argued there was no limit to Trump's goal to use tariff bullying to chip away at the sovereignty of other countries, on any issue at all, pointing directly to the Brazil case as a parallel example. That's one economist's characterization and framing, not a neutral fact, but it reflects a view held by a meaningful segment of trade analysts, watching how these deadlines are being used as leverage well beyond narrow questions of dairy quotas or lumber duties. So what would it actually look like if Carney does not blink, if August 19 arrives and passes without a signed agreement? Based on everything confirmed so far, 3 things would happen in fairly quick succession. First, the 50% tariffs on the 3 lists of goods. Dairy, the misleadingly named motor vehicles category covering everything from lumber to cosmetics, and the broader catalog of consumer and industrial products, would take effect automatically, since the legal authority for them was already established when Trump signed the Section 338 proclamations. Second, according to Charette's own reported warning to Greer, Canada would treat that outcome as the end of the current negotiating window, shifting from talks into some form of retaliation, rather than continuing to negotiate under an active tariff regime. Third, based on Carney's public comments, that retaliation would likely draw at minimum from the existing playbook Canada has used since 2018. Targeted counter-tariffs on American goods, with steel, aluminum, and autos as the most likely starting point, given that Ottawa deliberately kept retaliatory tariffs on those 3 sectors in place, even after removing broader counter-tariffs last September. Whether that retaliation would expand further into more politically charged territory like Ontario's push to restrict potash or oil exports remains genuinely unresolved and contested within Canada's own government. Carney has so far declined to rule anything out publicly, while simultaneously avoiding any commitment to the more aggressive options premiers like Doug Ford have floated. Alberta's Danielle Smith represents an active counterweight inside Canada's own political system against exactly that kind of energy sector escalation, and experts like Fen Osler-Hampson have explicitly warned against it on strategic grounds, arguing the imbalance of economic power between the 2 countries makes that particular form of retaliation especially risky for Canada. There is also the question of what happens to CUSMA itself in a no-deal scenario. Because the United States already declined to renew the pact in July, triggering a review process that formally extends out to 2036, a collapse of the current August 19th talks would not necessarily mean the trade agreement disappears overnight, but it would leave the broader legal framework governing North American trade in an unusually uncertain state, with the 50% tariffs applying even to some goods that would otherwise have qualified for CUSMA's tariff-free treatment. That detail reported by Reuters is one of the more significant technical wrinkles in this dispute. Unlike earlier rounds of tariffs, this round is explicitly designed to reach goods that the original North American trade agreement was supposed to protect. Now, to be fully transparent about where the reporting stands and where it doesn't, the core facts in this story are well established and drawn from named, checkable sources. The Section 338 proclamations Trump signed on July the 20th, confirmed by multiple outlets including CNBC, the specific product lists and dollar figures, confirmed by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business and the Associated Press, Carney's public statements, drawn directly from his own remarks, to reporters as reported by CBC News, The Globe and Mail, and Investing. Come citing Reuters, and the state of negotiations as of August 13th through 17, based on reporting from CBC News, Reuters, and The Globe and Mail, citing sources described as having direct or close knowledge of the talks. What remains genuinely unverified or contested includes the precise contents of any near-final deal. Details like the F-35 commitment or the exact scope of Section 232 relief are based on unnamed sources and have not been confirmed on the record by either government. Whether Trump ultimately signs off on any negotiated framework before the deadline, and whether Canada's retaliation, if it comes, extends beyond steel, aluminum, and autos into energy or critical minerals, are both open questions that no source has resolved as of this recording. Anything presented here as a specific future outcome rather than a reported possibility should be treated with appropriate skepticism, because, as both Canadian and American officials have acknowledged, nothing is settled until it's signed. What makes this particular deadline different from the string of tariff threats that came before it is the scale of what's actually on the table, and the political cost of backing down on either side. For Trump, having already let the August 1st, 2025 deadline take effect rather than extend it, Credibility is arguably on the line if he blinks now after signing a formal legal proclamation invoking a specific statute. For Carney, having built his entire public posture around the phrase, "Canada will not accept a bad deal," repeated so many times that it has become something close to a governing slogan, capitulating to a lopsided agreement carries its own steep domestic political risk, particularly with premiers like Doug Ford watching closely and Canadian public opinion, according to earlier polling from the Angus Reid Institute, having shifted meaningfully toward wanting a tougher response rather than a conciliatory one. Whatever happens in the coming hours, this is not a story that resolves itself neatly either way. A signed deal by August 19th would likely still be described, even by the negotiators themselves, as only phase 1 of a longer process, given the reported existence of a phase 2 agenda covering defense commitments and other unresolved issues. A no-deal outcome would trigger tariffs that, by most economic estimates, hurt specific Canadian industries and regions significantly while leaving the broader national economy bruised rather than shattered, and would very likely trigger a Canadian response that reopens a trade war both countries have spent the better part of the last year and a half trying unsuccessfully to fully close. So here's the honest question worth sitting with as this deadline plays out. If you were in Mark Carney's position, watching Ontario's premier push for maximum retaliation while Alberta's premier urges restraint, watching your own negotiators warn Washington that a failed deal means the end of talks rather than a pause, and watching a president who has already let one deadline bite without blinking, would you hold the line on August 19th, or would you take whatever deal was on the table just to stop the bleeding? That's not a rhetorical question. Different people who've spent years watching this relationship closely land in genuinely different places on it, and reasonable people looking at the same set of facts have reached opposite conclusions about what Ottawa should do next. It's also worth understanding how Canada arrived at its current, narrower set of retaliatory tariffs, because that history explains exactly why steel, aluminum, and autos carry such symbolic weight in any future response. Canada's Department of Finance maintains a public, continuously updated list of American products subject to counter tariffs, and according to that government record, Ottawa removed counter tariffs on most U.S. imports effective September 1st of last year, specifically in recognition of the fact that most Canadian goods were still entering the United States tariff-free under CUSMA at that point. The government's own language described the move as an attempt to incentivize a negotiated settlement while explicitly preserving tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos because, as the department put it, intensive negotiations with the U.S. continue in exactly those sectors. That is not incidental. It means that if Carney does choose to retaliate after August 19th, he would not be starting from zero. He would be escalating a set of tariffs that Ottawa deliberately kept warm sector by sector for almost a year in anticipation of exactly this kind of moment. There is a useful parallel from Canada's earlier trade disputes with the United States that helps frame what a full-scale retaliation might eventually resemble if this standoff drags on, rather than resolving quickly. Back in 2018, when Washington first imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum during Trump's first term, Ottawa responded within days with counter tariffs covering nearly $13 billion worth of American goods, ranging from steel and aluminum products to yogurt and whiskey. A deliberately broad and politically symbolic list designed to spread economic pain across multiple American states and congressional districts, rather than concentrating it narrowly. Christophe Bondy, a former Canadian trade negotiator who spoke to NPR at the time, described that approach as a calculated way to maximize domestic American political pressure on the White House. Whether Carney's government would reach for a similarly broad list this time, or stick to the narrower steel aluminum auto core it has maintained since last September, is precisely the kind of decision that depends on how the next few days unfold. And it's a decision Ottawa has not yet had to make in public. That's where things stand as of this recording, with the deadline now just hours away, and both governments still describing the outcome as genuinely undecided.